Welcome once again to the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy at Brown University. We're pleased to see so many Brown students, faculty, alumni, and other interested people joining us tonight. I'm Richard Arenberg, visiting professor of the practice of political science and a senior fellow at the Watson Institute. I'm honored to serve this year as interim director of the Taubman Center, which is a part of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. The Taubman Center seeks to impact American politics and policy through scholarship, public opinion polling, conferences, workshops, academic research, internships, think tanks, and public officials. Tonight, we present the 23rd in our series of programs. We have a very special guest tonight, one of America's great authors, James Reston Jr. Jim has authored 18 widely celebrated books, 3 plays, and an endless list of articles in major national publications. His most recent book is a novel focused on one of the terrorists on 9/11. We'll explore that a bit tonight. He won the Prix Italia and the DuPont Columbia Award for his chilling 1983 90-minute radio documentary on National Public Radio entitled Father Cares, The Last of Jonestown. His last 5 historical works, Galileo: A Life, The Last Apocalypse, Warriors of God, Dogs of God, and Defenders of the Faith, have been translated into 13 foreign languages. Warriors of God and Collision at Home Plate have been optioned to Hollywood. The Last Apocalypse was a main selection of the Book of the Month Club. Warriors of God is an international bestseller with over 200,000 copies sold worldwide and still selling. Fragile Innocence, his memoir of bringing up his handicapped daughter, reached number 8 on the Washington Post bestseller list. In 1976, Reston was David Frost's Watergate advisor for the famous Frost-Nixon interviews seen by 57 million people worldwide. His narrative of that experience was published in 2007 and entitled The Conviction of Richard Nixon, the untold story of the Frost-Nixon interviews, and was the main inspiration to the British playwright Peter Morgan's in the making of his London play entitled Frost-Nixon. Reston is a major character and the narrator of the play. In the Hollywood adaptation of the play, directed by Ron Howard and nominated for 5 Academy Awards, Reston was played by the actor Sam Rockwell. His articles have appeared in New Yorker, Vanity Fair, Time, the New York Times Magazine, Smithsonian, National Geographic, Esquire, American Theater, Playboy, and Rolling Stone. He recently contributed the foreword to the National Geographic book, Eyewitness to History. In recent years, he's lectured widely in the United States, Smithsonian, Library of Congress, Woodrow Wilson Center, and overseas on the Millennium, the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, and the Ottomans at Vienna, citing their relevance to modern issues. He's been a fellow at the American Academy in Rome, a fellow at the John W. Klug Center at the Library of Congress, and a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington. He was born in New York. Great honor to introduce the very distinguished author and my good friend, James Reston Jr. Welcome to Brown, Jim.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Let me start by asking you a little about your most recent book, The 19th Hijacker. It's a great book, by the way, so riveting that I read it in one sitting. It explores the reluctance of the 19th hijacker, the pilot of the plane that went down in Pennsylvania. But my question is, why fiction?
Well, that's the starting point for any discussion about this book, Richard. I, as you said, was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington that was run some years ago by Lee Hamilton. And Lee Hamilton was the co-chair of the 9/11 Commission. And I was in between books really 10 years ago at lunch with Lee, and he was talking about his work at the commission. And the conversation devolved into the perpetrators. And he said there was one in particular that he and the other commissioners were particularly interested in. And as you said, that was the pilot that took the plane down in Shanksville. He was interesting for several reasons. One was he was the lone Lebanese of the 19, not Saudi Arabian. Came from a very fine middle-class family in Beirut, was sent to Hamburg, Germany to get his higher education, and there fell into the circle of Mohammed Atta, the ringleader for 9/11. And so the second thing that was very interesting to the commissioners was that this real character almost pulled out of the operation a month beforehand. And he did so, or he almost did so, because of a romantic relationship that he had with a woman in Germany. So between the fact that he had plenty going for him as an individual coming out of Lebanon, and secondly, because he was very conflicted about the mission because of this romantic relationship, that interested me immediately. And Lee said he would help me any way that I could, but I quickly found out that all the documents relating to the perpetrators in the commission files were classified. And they were classified because there were and are ongoing legal proceedings at Guantanamo Bay. And so until those were concluded, which in my view, they never will be concluded, that material will remain classified. So I came to this juncture where I had to decide, well, I can't do this as nonfiction, so I just give it up. Or I just couldn't stand to give it up because it was such an important story about a critical seminal event. So I decided that I would write it as a novel.
Well, you've touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering, having read this rich portrayal of this terrorist and his relationship, I came away wondering how much of a factual foundation was it based on? How much were you able to learn about him?
Yes, well, if you dig deep and dig long, you can put together a story pretty well and pretty deep. Any self-respecting historical novelist does every bit of historical research on the subject that they possibly can. And then they just get to that end point, and you just launch into the imagination at that point. It pleases me that it sounds like you and certainly others that have read this feel that one of the great strengths of this novel is its authenticity. its believability, that it could have happened this way. I don't know what the personality of the actual terrorist was, but there were enough lines of interest there to build a character. And if I made him more ambivalent than the actual character was, it seemed to me as a novelist that was perfectly okay, because it allowed me to write a dramatic story that had a thrust towards a climax. If that character had been somebody like Muhammad Atta, the ringleader of the thing, I would not have been interested in that story at all, because Atta is just a through line. He's just a flat line of radicalism. In this case, I think the actual character was indeed ambivalent, and I just settled on that theme for dramatic reasons.
And in that ambivalence, also you get an illumination of, the central question that we all wonder about these terrorists, and that's why.
Yes, well, I've been to Shanksville on a number of occasions, and it's always struck me that here we have a national park in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where that plane went down, and thousands, tens of thousands of people go to visit it. And I always kind of imagined the 8-year-old boy looking up to his father and say, well, why did they do this? And if you go to Shanksville, you will find that there is almost nothing about the perpetrators. It's almost exclusively about the heroic behavior of the Flight 93 passengers and a lot of other detail. But the problem of the perpetrators and their motivations is really not fully on display in a memorial. Nor has this side of the thing really been explored in such depth, if I may say so humbly, until I came along with this novel. So it's as if the story of 9/11, only half of it has been told up until now. And there is a further point to make on this, I think, and that is that it's important to tell the story of the perpetrators and try to imagine what their motivations were, because the threat goes on. And we need to know what is driving these characters, what motivates them. But that's been something of a taboo subject in America up until now. I am very pleased to get into the conversation of the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and it's almost as if the 9/11 event was too raw for the American public until now. It was certainly too raw at the 10th anniversary, and the way in which the perpetrators have been portrayed is as monsters. And of course, they are monsters. But if you start a discussion or start an inquiry into criminals or perpetrators with the notion that they're evil from the beginning, then there's nowhere to go dramatically with that story.
Yeah, it's interesting. I read a Washington Post review of your book about Jim Jones, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But he observed of you, his larger purpose is to make the terribly irrational somehow understandable. When I read that, I thought, well, it could have been written about this book.
Yes. Yes. Well, what a wonderful review it was, right?
Yeah. Uh, Now, you've said of radical Islamists, if we really want to protect ourselves, we need to know what drives them and what makes them tick. Are there lessons here that might apply, for example, to our quest to understand QAnon believers or white supremacists that attacked the Capitol on January 6th?
Well, radicalism is a term that's thrown around very loosely, I think, in all kinds of circumstances, certainly in the 9/11 case and now with the January 6th case. And it's as if radicalism is some sort of final state that people get to, and they're just automatons at that point, is because we just know they're radicals. If that's the way you approach either 9/11 or January 6th, you'll never understand what drives them, what makes them tick, and maybe how to protect yourself against them as well. So I think there is a dynamic that is similar between these two cases. As I said, my relationship was deep with Lee Hamilton in relation to the 9/11 Commission. I've been arguing that there really should be a January 6th presidential commission. That January 6th falls in a category of about 5 or 6 events of the last 60 years, starting with the JFK assassination, moving on to the race riots of 1967 and 1968. We had a presidential commission on the Challenger disaster, and we had the 9/11 Commission. These are models that are very useful, I think, in considering the question of whether we should have a January 6th presidential commission. But certainly in terms of its overall historical importance, it clearly deserves to be in that category of 4 other seminal events.
Yeah, I served with Congressman Hamilton on the Iran-Contra Committee some years ago, and when I wrote my book on the filibuster, I went out to Indiana and had a wonderful interview with him, sort of getting a longtime House member's perspective on the roles of the Senate.
Right.
Now, you've written 18 books, I think it is. They cover a hugely broad range from medieval history to Vietnam to Watergate to baseball and to honest and perceptive biography. I'm wondering, is there a thread when you begin a new project? How is it typically born?
Well, when you list all of those things, it looks like this is a very scattered mind without a center, a center to it. I've always felt that, I wanted to move on to something new and fresh every single time, that I did not want to do a revised or a sequel to anything that I had done before. I think the critical thing about embracing a book idea is tremendous intellectual and emotional excitement about the material. And also in my case, almost pretty profound ignorance of what the story would be. So that the whole experience of writing a book over 2 or 3 years is an adventure, but driven by that intellectual fascination and emotional connection. So I think those are the important elements. I was a product of the civil rights era, having gone to college when the South was still partly segregated. At the University of North Carolina, the whole struggle over civil rights, took place beneath my feet, which was tremendously exciting. And then later on, not much later on, the whole issue for my generation about Vietnam and whether to serve in the military or to avoid service came on. So in my formative years between civil rights and Vietnam, there was internal conflict and passion, and I have milked, if that's the word, those early passions all my life. But I don't think that's different from other people who've spent their life writing books.
Well, I'm interested, given the depth and strength of your literary accomplishments, do you think of yourself as an academic, historian, a writer, or a journalist? Not that you have to be pigeonholed as any one thing, but I'm curious about how you think of it.
Well, a writer works. A writer as a title works pretty well. I'm certainly not an academic. I've written a fair amount of journalism, but it's all been subjective. I've never been much interested in objective journalism. I want to feel deeply whatever it is that I write about in whatever form, and it's allowed me to also explore certain subjects in different forms. In Jonestown, for example, the book was, a 3-4 year obsession, and it was made into a National Public Radio documentary out of the material that I had discovered. And then it became a play in Providence, yes, the right. Trinity Square Repertory Company. Wonderful experience for me. And I wrote a libretto for a Jim Jones opera. So that was an obsession to try to understand that thing. And I have said before that the whole literary life is really a series of obsessions.
Well, what was there about, talking about Jonestown, what was there about that mass suicide that we knew as the Jonestown massacre in faraway Guyana? What was it about that first drew you to it?
Well, the instant connection was to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And here was a story that I thought was an actual realization of the concept of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, this charismatic character who has a community, goes off into the darkness of the jungle and has this community, and then before their eyes slowly goes mad. So it really did have a literary impulse to start with, but beyond that, it relates to what I was just saying about civil rights and that obsession. I just couldn't believe in the 1970s that a charlatan like Jim Jones could use the ideology that I cared so much about racial equality and twist it in such a way that it would end up with that result. That just totally confounded me, and I wanted to try to understand it. So there's a bit of a connection with other books, including the 19th Hijacker, with that whole process.
Mm-hmm. Were you able to come to grips with what motivated Jones?
Well, he had an enormous ego. He was a master showman. Um, his um, his sermons, if you call it that, were just amazing to listen to, and he built um, this this amazing organization with thousands and thousands of followers. And like I was saying about 9/11 and this novel about monsters, you know, of course Jim Jones was a monster at the end,
Mhm.
but monsters don't build churches that have thousands upon thousands of followers if he doesn't have something going for him that is extremely attractive. And so I I thought it was very important to understand the attractiveness of the Reverend Jim Jones um, long before you tried to understand what actually happened in the jungle.
Mhm. Uh, and when you did get to that point of the climatic event in the jungle, how do you understand the followers, the motivation, how is it that so many people could follow a leader down this suicidal path?
Well, that was precisely the Inquisition, if that's the right word, about the play at Trinity Rep, which was called Jonestown Express. That it had 4 or 5 prototypical characters from the Jonestown thing, and I with different motivations. Nobody knows, nobody can know out of that 1,000 people how many happily went to the Kool-Aid, or how many resisted in their heart, um, how many went along because it was a perfect tyranny. I mean, this is part of the story that they couldn't get out. That he, in the end, down there in the jungle, had constructed the perfect tyranny where you just couldn't escape. So they were prisoners of his. So who knows what how it would have shaken out in terms of who was really going along with this whole process and who was resisting.
Uh, I want to turn to another book about a tragedy, but one not as profound as the two we've been talking about. I've read a number of your books. Oddly, among my favorites is The Collision at Home Plate. I don't know why I say oddly. It's just uh, it's the story of the fallen baseball hero Pete Rose and the baseball commissioner who banned him, Bart Giamatti, the former president of Yale University. Uh, I love the whole idea of twin biographies, chronicling vastly different people from different worlds, moving inevitably towards an unexpected climax. And what you fashioned as the collision at home plate. The burden may have hastened, some people say, Giamatti's death. What was it like to research that particular book, and what did you take away from it?
Well, I really was excited about attempting the form of a dual biography. When this first occurred to me to do, um, Pete Rose was, um, in terrible financial trouble and about to go to jail, and Bart Giamatti was somewhat of a hero, but these two lives from such different worlds coming into clash was something that excited me as a literary question. I would, some people have said that the trauma of doing the Rose investigation ultimately killed Bart Giamatti. He was I never met him, but all that I learned about, he was a tremendous character, a fascinating cultural, wonderful conversationalist, very broad, just totally captivating in every way. That was one character. The other character was not captivating as a personality at all. He was really rough, and so for a sentimentalist about baseball like Bart Giamatti, to have had to, in effect, investigate and prosecute this fabulous athlete was a tremendously taxing thing. The whole question of whether Rose was fairly treated, or whether he's fairly treated today, is one of those stories of sports that just carries on. I initially had a notion that Pete Rose should go into the Hall of Fame, but into the museum part of the Hall of Fame, because then you could explain why he was the hit king, had more hits than anybody else, and also explain why betting on baseball is the cardinal sin of baseball. So it lends itself to a major display in Cooperstown on that level. And if you've ever been to Cooperstown, in some ways, the least interesting part of the whole thing is the hall of the plaques. It's very static and very uninteresting. What's interesting is all the lore of this great game. So here you have a wonderful case, a case that continues to reverberate today. I changed my view about that in recent years and think that he should be in the Hall of Fame, get his plaque, given all the other sins that we now know about modern baseball players. So anyway, it was really fun to spend a week at Yale and then a week in the dugout talking to his former fellow players. So it was a really fun project.
Did you ever meet Pete Rose?
No, I never did. But I'm desperately hoping, of course, that this movie that has been proposed will be made about this case. Okay. And there's been a lot of interest in Hollywood in the book, but nobody has quite got there to the production phase of things. It would make a great movie.
I want to ask you about another of your books. I feel like I'm jumping around here, but you've covered so much ground that it's hard to do it all justice. But another book I learned a lot from was your biography of John Connolly, the Democratic governor turned Republican presidential candidate. The two things I knew about Connolly were that he'd been in the car when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and that years later, as a perceived Republican frontrunner for president, he was humiliated in the primaries by Ronald Reagan and wound up, I think it was, with one delegate to the Republican convention. He was a tragic figure in some ways, but what was it that brought your specific attention to John Connolly?
Well, accident plays a plays a role in a writer's life sometimes. And the John Connolly project was a kind of an accident. I was approached in the mid 1980s to do a biography of Jesse Helms, because I have these deep North Carolina roots, and I didn't really want to do a biography of Jesse Helms, but the offer was tantalizing. Fortunately, I learned after signing a contract to do that Helms book that a Helms book was coming out in another 6 months or so. And so I went back to the publisher and said, this is not a subject that can bear two biographies in close proximity. And this is important, Richard, because this was in the old days of gentlemanly publishing. And my editor, a wonderful man by the name of Edward Burlingame, said, well, we'll just keep this contract in force and we'll look for a replacement subject. And not long thereafter, John Connolly had this huge fall from grace after his political life, where he had gone back to Texas just to make as much money as he possibly could to become really, truly Texas rich. And he got in with some bad people and had some bad luck. And he had this tremendous fall into bankruptcy, which was very humiliating for him. So I was very interested in the arc of this life. He was an epic figure. He was one of the giants of the 60s and 70s, and 50s, 60s, and 70s, actually. And the end of his life had this very interesting twist to it. So I embraced it. As you said, he was in the car with JFK in November of 1963.
Actually hit with a bullet, right?
And it's very clear that the first bullet went through John F. Kennedy's neck and into the back of John Connolly, who was sitting in a jump seat right in front of JFK, and was terribly, terribly wounded. The JFK story is one of those stories. I mentioned 4 or 5 of the last 60 years, and certainly that's one of the most important ones. I was fascinated by the whole story of the JFK assassination and the story of Lee Harvey Oswald. And it was almost as if I had to pull myself away from the JFK story and preoccupy myself with all the rest of that life. But that was my first experience of a formal biography.
Did I read somewhere that you had a view or raised the question of whether there was a question of whether Lee Harvey Oswald's real target was Connolly?
Yes, I own that theory. And in a way, it stitches to what we've been talking about before, that the Great Warren Commission was established to look into the JFK assassination, and they did everything right except one thing, and that was to delve into the motivation of Lee Harvey Oswald. They simply said, oh, well, he was a communist, or he wanted to be a figure of history. But it was a wretched little man that it's just inconceivable that some abstract ideology like communism, or an abstract idea about being a figure of history could have motivated a horrendous murder like that. There had to be something deeper. And that's my initial investigation into that came through the Connolly biography. And sometimes that's the way it happens with stories. I mentioned how writing books can be a kind of journey of excitement, that you discover things that you didn't know. It turns out that there was a relationship between, I've got a helicopter going over me here, a relationship between Lee Harvey Oswald and John Connolly that went back to the days that Oswald was in Russia. You remember he tried to defect after his Marine Corps experience. And he was in Russia for about a year and a half, and it didn't work out well for him. And so he wanted to come home. He realized that with a 9th grade education and having tried to defect to the Soviet Union with a Russian wife and child, he's going to have a really tough time getting a job. And so he wrote a letter to the then Secretary of the Navy, who came from Fort Worth, Texas, like him, saying that his Marine Corps discharge had been summarily changed from honorable to dishonorable without any proceeding at all. And it was an unfairness and an atrocity. And he wanted this Secretary of the Navy to redress this unfairness. And about 6 weeks later, he got a letter back in Russia from one John Connolly saying, "I'm no longer the Secretary of the Navy. Here's my successor's name, sincerely yours." And it came to Oswald in Russia in an envelope that said, "John Connolly for governor of Texas," with the big picture of Connolly's head in a Texas star. And I think it's reasonable to conclude that that was the beginning of a tremendous grudge on the part of Lee Harvey Oswald against John Connolly. And this is supported by evidence in the Warren Commission, most especially the interviews with Marina Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald's wife, who said in 3 different occasions that her husband, Lee Oswald, was gunning for Connolly that day, not for President Kennedy.
That's really fascinating. Let me move from John Connolly to Galileo, who was another of your fascinating subjects, persecuted by the Roman Inquisition in 1633 for his support of the observation that the earth traveled around the sun and the sun was not fixed in the heavens. Of course, science and Galileo were later borne out. In 1992, the Catholic Church formally admitted it had made a mistake. Are there parallels to the insults to science that seem to be so much a part of our current politics around things like climate change and even evolution?
Well, before I get to that, I would like to tell you how that book came to be.
Sure.
As you mentioned, I was a candidate to be the first writer to go in space on the space shuttle. And the writer program was supposed to follow the teachers program. I was the Newsweek and BBC and PBS candidate to to be the first writer in space. And that, of course, all went down with the Challenger when the teacher went down. That was the end of both the teacher program and the writer program. But in preparation for that whole thing, I was very into NASA things. I did 2 films for public television on that, wrote a number of magazine articles about it and so forth. I was really into it. In the early 60s, there was one of the great missions of NASA was called the Galileo mission. And the Galileo mission was one of these huge NASA missions going to the planet of Jupiter. And so in the mid 80s, coming out of my candidacy for the space shuttle, I proposed a book on Galileo, and it was going to have 3 parts. One would be the quick retelling of the scientific tale, going to that sort of symphonic moment when he turns the telescope to the planet of Jupiter and sees the moons of Jupiter going around the planet, the first human being to see that. And the second part would be the clash with the Catholic Church on this eternal question of science versus faith. And the last was going to be on the NASA Galileo mission. So my editor took this complicated book proposal to the Frankfurt Book Fair. And with one voice, European publishers came back and said, Galileo is such a great story, but what is this strange tripartite concept that your author has here? Go back to him and disabuse him of this complicated project and give us a fast-moving retelling of the great Galileo story. And so that's what I did. On the scientific level, of course, he is the touchstone for scientific discovery that comes out of evidence, the evidence of the eyes, as opposed to the abstract theory. On the question of science versus faith, he is the touchstone. That case is the touchstone about guilt or innocence of a scientist in relation to faith. So it was a biography that in a way ruined me for biography, because it was so perfect, the trajectory of the rising action to the use of this little spyglass to look at the moons of Jupiter. And by the way, there was this tremendous character at the center of it who was very anti-authoritarian and had no truck with the supercilious scholars around him. So there was a great personality at the center. So getting to the moment of discovering the moons of Jupiter and all the other discoveries that he did and that came afterwards about the use of the telescope. And so that would have been enough for a great biography, but it was only the first step. And then you get into the clash with the church. And so I've never since been able to quite replicate that perfect parabola that the Galileo story represents.
Great. Now you were the researcher for David Frost's famous interviews with Richard Nixon, in which Nixon for the first time acknowledged guilt in Watergate. Why was that acknowledgement so important? After all, he had been out of office for 3 years.
He'd been out of office and he had never been confronted with his crimes and misdemeanors. And he made it into a money-making proposition with David Frost. I think that was a main motivation for Nixon to finally agree to a sit-down interview that would be very, very extensive. I think, well, just to tell you how I happened to get involved, I came to Washington in 73 and 74 to witness the Watergate hearings and then the demise of Richard Nixon, which, by the way, at that time, I thought was going to be the greatest political drama of my life. So I had taken off teaching from Carolina to come up to Washington, then went back to teach creative writing. And David Frost, having gotten this exclusive deal and had to, in effect, build a whole network around this project, he came through Washington knowing that the whole thing would rise and fall on his interrogation of Nixon over Watergate. And so he was looking for somebody who could help him do the research and help him craft the interrogation of the thing. And fortunately, somebody thought about me.
He had somewhat of a reputation as kind of a soft interviewer, didn't he?
Exactly. And that was part, I think, of the motivation of Nixon wanting to go into this, that he was going to both make a lot of money and he was going to walk all over this softy from England, and he was going to rehabilitate his reputation in the whole process. So it seemed like a very sweetheart deal from Nixon's standpoint. But Nixon didn't know that that Frost was hiring somebody that was really going to delve deeply into this. And actually, jumping way over the story, Nixon had written in a book afterwards that he mainly faulted those Nixon haters and that had a Vietnam grudge, and like Reston, for the way that thing turned out. But at any rate, that's what got me into it. Now, I came up to Washington. An office was set up in Georgetown that had a bed for me in the back of this apartment, and became the office for the project during the day. And I did a massive amount of research on the whole thing. But I was able to find some interviews or documents of interviews that had never seen the light of day, and these were critical to my interrogation document that I crafted for David Frost about how to salt in this new material right at the beginning to throw Nixon off his game. Because, Nixon this had been his life. He'd lived Watergate. He knew every single part of it and knew everything that was in the public realm. So that's what happened. And just to jump to your question, the interrogation itself was a kind of facts and dates interrogation that salted these various discoveries that I had made in confronting Nixon along the way. And it was a withering prosecution. David Frost was the very best man in the world to do it if he did his homework, which ultimately he did, because he was a showman and an entertainer, not just a straightforward television journalist. And so there came a moment in that whole thing where one of Nixon's people came storming onto the set and insisted that the thing be stopped. And there ensued a uh, about a 15-minute break in the proceedings and furious back and forth between the two sides about, okay, if we let up on the interrogation, what are we going to get? Are we going to get an apology? Are we going to get an acknowledgement of his criminality? And nothing was agreed by the Nixon side on that. But Frost changed his tone completely and elicited first the acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and secondly, an apology. Nothing has ever happened like that in American history before. And because we knew what we had when the thing was getting ready for broadcast, the anticipation of the broadcast of the Watergate program was just incredible. And that's why, as you said at the opening, 57 million people watched that interrogation.
And the event was later made into a play.
Yes,
and a motion picture.
that's correct. Yeah, and I was very involved in that whole process. It's it's really that play and movie is based upon a narrative that I wrote when I went back to Chapel Hill after the experience in 1977, and that was a critical and essential source for the playwright to construct his drama.
Great. You've said that the actor playing Nixon had not impersonated Nixon, but had become a totally original character, inspired by Nixon, but perhaps different from him. I'm wondering about that where you feel that line, in this kind of depicting this kind of historical event. Where do you draw that line?
Well, I've done a fair amount of theater now, and had quite a lot of experience with very fine actors. And in the case of Frank Langella, it was he was the finest. I mean, he was just an absolute fabulous actor, and he looked absolutely nothing like Richard Nixon. And for somebody who was just a bystander looking at that project as it went forward, must have wondered deeply how this actor could ever bring it off. The way that he brought it out is essential to the acting, to the art of acting, which is to build characterization from the inside out and not from the outside in. So in other words, I feel sure that Langella studied a lot of films about Richard Nixon, but that would only have been his starting point, I think, for building a characterization from the inside. Where you draw the line, of course, the movie was based upon the play. I was invited by. Sorry, let me just stop that. I was invited by the producers of the London play to come over to London to be in the first reading of the play with Frank Langella and Martin Sheen, who played David Frost. And the original reading of that play was in 2 acts. And when it ended, Peter Morgan turned to the director and said, "We can't do this in 2 acts because we'll lose all the passion and interest that we've built up in the first act, because people will go out into the lobby and have a drink and have conversation, and and we'll lose all the stuff that we've built up in the first act. So the process of compression began at that point. So the actual forcing Nixon to acknowledge his crime and apologize for it happens in 7 minutes in the play and in the movie. In actuality, the taping of it was over a two-day period and with 8-hour sessions. So there were 16 hours that brought Nixon to that point. So the art of the theater is in the clash of personality and the clash of tension, but it's also the compression of characterization into an essence. And so we go to the theater and to movies that are based on actual events to sort of get an essence of the thing, not to get every fact correct.
I could go on doing this for a couple of hours, but we've promised to take some questions from the audience. So let me turn to a couple of audience questions. And Stephen asks, do you believe that there never was a 20th hijacker, that there were 19 because of the phrase in the Quran that says about the wardens of the fire, above it there are 19, and that is why Osama bin Laden used only 19 hijackers?
That's a fascinating question. And the text is absolutely right, but it was used, I think, by Al-Qaeda after it became 19 instead of 20. It was supposed to be 20. And the plane was brought down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, specifically because there were only 4 hijackers instead of 5. The other 3 planes had 5 hijackers on it. And the one that was the 5th that was supposed to be on Flight 93 had been stopped coming in to Florida and was sent immediately back from where he came. And I think that character ended up in Guantanamo Bay. At any rate, that's why it became 19 instead of 20. But the text of 19 in Islamic text is absolutely true. I have not been to the Middle East since I got into this, writing this novel, so I don't really know how the attack on America is received in the Middle East now, and especially received by sentimentalists about the attack itself. But if there are sentimentalists about it, I'm sure they would focus on that passage in Scripture.
Brian, who volunteers that he's from Rockville, Maryland, asks, tell me more about what intrigued you about the pilot. What would you like readers to take away from this book?
Well, as people will discover when they get into this, that this is a story that is told in the aftermath of 9/11 through the technique and the device of tape recordings that I have imagined the hijacker tape recorded for his girlfriend as he tried to figure out whether he was going to go forward with the operation or whether he was going to bail out at the end and they were going to flee to some safe place somewhere. So I think the construction of the novel is unusual, and the relationship to a lover who is not really sure entirely what is going on with her boyfriend. That allowed me to portray a character who you didn't really know whether she was in the know about what he was doing or not. Probably she was not, but it raised to me the philosophical question that we have all the time with these seminal crimes, of the people that are around the criminal. Were they complicit in some way? And it raises the philosophical question of moral authority or moral responsibility. This is a novel that only has 3 characters to it, and the third is a frumpy German policeman who is trying to find out whether the girlfriend knows what the conspiracy is, because in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, everybody was terrified there was going to be a second wave of terror. So this is, between these three characters, there's a lot going on. People seem to ask straight away, when they don't know what I've actually done with this novel, is this a sympathetic portrait? And the answer definitively to that question is no, this is not a sympathetic question, but it does try to understand how any human being can start in a fine family in Beirut and pass through Hamburg, get training in Florida, and end up in the mud of Shanksville. How any human being could go on that trajectory of life. And he is, by far the actual character. And I think my fictional character is really a lot more interesting than probably the actual character was. But for the journey that character goes on to end up a month beforehand, either going forward with the operation or bailing out.
Are you convinced that the target of that fourth plane was the U.S. Capitol building?
There's no doubt about that, Richard. There's no doubt about it. It's very, very clear in the documents themselves. It's certainly been embraced by Congress.
Right.
There is a plaque in the U.S. Capitol that celebrates the passengers of Flight 93, and I mean, it's always the sort of afterthought, the Shanksville thing, for a lot of people, most people, I suppose. But all you have to do is have a bit of imagination to imagine how much worse 9/11 would have been if those passengers had not been successful.
Right. And
the U.S. Capitol had been destroyed on that day. And they were within 20 minutes of that happening. So it's a horrendous story of terror that could have been so much worse.
The only reason I asked that question is I was in the Capitol building on that day, and a lot of the early speculation was that the target was the White House. But it always seemed to me that the Capitol was more logical, just in terms of the lack of skills that the pilot likely had. It'd be much more difficult to reach the White House than to the Capitol, straight up the mall.
That's an essential point, and absolutely compelling, what you've just said. If you compare it to the the trajectory of the plane that hit the Pentagon. That was a brilliant bit of aviation on the part of the hijacker that hit the Pentagon, because the Pentagon was so low slung. And he did, I've never quite studied that thing, but it's very clear in talking to people along the way that he had to do some very complicated maneuvers to be able to hit the Pentagon. So you can imagine how much harder it would have been to hit the White House, whereas the Capitol is just sitting up there like a sitting duck.
Right. Thomas says, I'm reading Rick Perlstein's book, Reaganland. In it, John Connally is depicted as having many of the narcissistic qualities of our most recent ex-president. Is that accurate?
Well, I think John Connally is a much more interesting figure than Donald Trump. He is certainly more important in the long trajectory of history than Trump. Yes, Connally was narcissistic, but aren't all politicians, Richard? You know better than I do about that. Or do you ever come across any humble characters, any Uriah Heeps who were congressmen? You did?
There are some. There are some. It's interesting. Some are, very, very humble in personal and real live personal interaction in their real lives, but when they're playing the role of the politician, then they're able to be, much more aggressive.
Yeah, well, Connally was very, very important to the rise of Lyndon Johnson. He was important as a governor of Texas. He was hugely important in the JFK assassination day. He was an important Secretary of the Treasury. The end of his life in the bankruptcy was interesting. That's over time far, far more interesting story than Donald Trump will ever be. But also there is always, I look at who is the character at the center. I think Connally had a lot more substance than Trump does.
Thomas asks, compared to the 4 9/11 terrorist teams, the insurgents of January 6th seem like rank amateurs. Should that make the January 6th group any less culpable?
No, obviously not. We'll have to see how this finally sorts out with the 300 and more people who are charged with crimes. When you have a handful of characters like the attack of 9/11, I mean, if you can get this, accept this, that was, as an attack, a brilliantly conceived attack that was conceived over a period of 2 or 3 years at least, with a very, very small handful of people. And that's qualitatively quite different from a mob. What each of the actual attackers in the 4 planes did was individually so much more horrendous than one of the mobsters who came forward. So I think that's the real difference between this 2 sets of terrorists. That one is a a discrete handful of people who were, trained, and the ideological side of the thing about the clash between Islamic Middle East and the industrial West is just a totally different kind of a situation.
Maria asks an interesting question. How does your writing process change from book to book? Are there things that remain the same always?
Well, I don't think it would be bragging to say that I'm a pretty disciplined guy. And in some ways, I think the discipline comes out of my military experience that, I wrote my first book, my first novel, when I was still in the Army, or started it. It was a novel. I was so conflicted by my presence in the military at the height of the Vietnam War, which I had come to be deeply against. And I would go off when I was stationed in Pearl Harbor to outer islands and write on the weekends. So I pulled out of that, being a morning worker, early morning in my early years. And I don't think any creative writer has more than about 3 hours of intense focus in any given day. And I've embraced that notion of a very intense working 2 or 3 hours in the morning, and that's carried me through. It's changed a little bit on the morning side because of our handicapped daughter, but it's so that's the discipline of the thing. You wondered about what might possibly be any sort of connection between these 18 books. In some ways, an essay that Virginia Woolf wrote about the art of biography has been a kind of a mantra for me about how I work. And she said that the great biography, and in my view, this applies to all writing, great biography focuses on what she calls the creative facts, not all the facts. That creative facts, or fertile facts, as she calls it, are facts that apply to character. And if you take that as a mantra, it can apply to writing fiction and nonfiction and biography and other kinds of factual writing. That's a kind of a through line for me, both the discipline and the approach to material, no matter what it is.
I did want to be sure to ask you about Vietnam. You mentioned it. You wrote a book about called Rift in the Earth, about the Vietnam Memorial and the controversy over it, and you've described the war as flawed and possibly immoral. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity to say something. It plays such a big role, I think, in your life and in the life of many of us in our generation. I'm just wondering what you think now about the legacy of that war and what it meant to our generation and how it's now affected the generations that have followed us.
Yes, well, that's a big topic. Yeah. As I said, my first novel came out of my own military experience at the height of the Vietnam War, being very much in conflict as a soldier, and oftentimes that's how literary lives begin, is somebody who is in in deep conflict about an experience that they're having. I've revisited Vietnam twice more, once in the mid 80s, in comparing the warfare of General Sherman of the Civil War to the total war of Vietnam. And then I was always fascinated by the the controversy that swirled around the making of the Vietnam Memorial in Washington. It involved art as well as history, as well as memory. And those were very nice themes to bring together to tell the story of how against a lot of opposition and a lot of craziness, that exquisite work of art, work of public art, got done. And there was a conflict within the artistic competition that I had a personal touch with, because I was friendly with Frederick Hart, who is the sculptor, the late Frederick Hart, who is the sculptor of the three soldiers that is on the periphery of Maya Lin's wall. And that was a horrendous, passionate conflict over two separate styles of art and how they could be married together in one memorial. Well, it's the most successful memorial in Washington by far, and it becomes a place of meditation and of healing, and it's rather overwhelming to go there to watch people, rub names off it. I wanted to include in my story of that that a final chapter on the one GI friend that I served with, who is on that wall, who was killed in 1968 in the Battle of Hue, never having fired a shot. It was a kind of pointless death. And going to your question, I mean, I think a lot of people would conclude that the Vietnam War was pointless in the end, with a terrible, terrible cost to a generation. Mm-hmm. I think subsequent generations, the memory has receded, of course. Anybody in college now, the Vietnam would be, if they think about it for a minute, it would be a total abstraction. There's no concept at all of young people of what our generation went through back and forth about that disastrous war. But I'm not sure that the lessons of Vietnam have really been learned. We seem to get drawn back into pointless conflict, and also pointless conflict that is spurred by lies, like the fake intelligence that started the Vietnam War and the fake intelligence that started the Iraq War. So we don't learn these lessons as we go forward.
Before we run out of time, I always like to ask accomplished guests who come to Brown. There are many Brown students in the audience who I'm sure would like to hear how you progressed through your career, how you got started, and how related to that, what's your advice for a young college student now who would like to have a career as a writer?
Well, the world has changed so dramatically from the decades that I worked on my books. I wanted to have a literary life. I wanted to lead the life of a writer. And that's a fairly daunting thing to embrace early on, because it's very hard to make a living as a writer. And you have to be ready for failure, and you have to be ready for poverty and so forth. There were many deep valleys in my career, but I persisted because this is the life that I wanted to lead. So I think it goes down to this question of commitment at the beginning, and passion, and the readiness to write about what you really care about. And if you focus on what you really care about, that can sustain you for quite a while. My career is in contrast to other writers who are assigned to write certain things and are given commissions of one sort or another. That's only happened to me twice in my life, and thankfully in books that were that I could embrace once they were suggested to me. But I think that's where it begins. But it's not an easy road, and there's not all that much low-hanging fruit out there that other people have gone to first. But I'm very fortunate to have been drawn into being a teacher of creative writing in the early part of my career, and being associated with some very estimable writers and novelists. And that's, I wanted what they had, and that was a lucky thing. So, as I said before, accident plays a great part in any writer's life, and you got to have some luck, but you got to be ready for bad luck as well.
Well, Jim Reston, I want to thank you so much for spending this. It's really been a great opportunity for the Brown community, and we thank you for that. And I want to thank our audience as well.
Well, I'm very sentimental about Providence, so I was very excited when you invited me.
Well, maybe we'll do it again sometime when we're past all of this and you can actually visit us in Providence.